The Call of the Wild by Jack London, Chapter 7, A New Life. John Thornton's feet had frozen the previous December on the way to Dawson. His partners had made him comfortable and had gone on. They promised to return with a raft to carry him to Dawson. Lying on a riverbank through the long spring days, John's pain left him. Buck, too, slowly won back his strength. The four of them, Buck, John Thornton, Skeet, and Nig, loafed lazily as they waited for the raft. Skeet was a little Irish setter who quickly made friends with Buck. She had a doctor quality about her. As Buck lay near death, she washed his wounds on the way a mother cat washed her kittens. Nig was equally friendly, but somewhat shy. She was a half bloodhound and half deerhound, with the laughing eyes that showed her good nature. To Buck's surprise, these dogs showed no jealousy toward him. They seemed to share the kindness of John Thornton. As Buck grew stronger, he romped and played with Skeet and Nig. Even John Thornton joined in all sorts of silly games. This was a new life for Buck. Love, genuine love, with his for the first time. This he had never known, even with Judge Miller. With the judge there had been a noble friendship, but John Thornton had roused in Buck a love and devotion that was new to him. This man had saved his life, and more than that, he was the ideal master. Others looked after their dogs out of a sense of duty or business. John cared for his dogs as though they were his children. He had a way of taking Buck's head roughly between his hands and drawing him close to his own. Buck knew no greater joy. Buck's love was expressed in adoration. Unlike Skeet and Nig, Buck never shoved his nose under Thornton's hand or rested his head on his knee. Buck was content to keep his distance. He would lie for hours at Thornton's feet, or sometimes he would lie further away, watching Thornton's movements. So strong was their union that Buck's gaze would cause Thornton to turn his head. The two would look at each other without speaking, but their hearts shined through their eyes. For a long time, Buck would not allow Thornton out of his sight. Other masters had come and gone. He feared that Thornton would also pass out of his life. Even at night, Buck was troubled by this fear. He would often creep into his master's tent and stand by the flap. In spite of this love for Thornton, Buck's primitive fury was still strong. Buck had become a creature of the wild Northland. Nothing of the soft Southland remained in him. But he would not steal from this man or attack his dogs. To any other man or any other dog, he showed no mercy. He had learned well the law of club and fang. Kill or be killed, eat or be eaten was the law. The past and the present were linked in Buck. The past pounded in him with a mighty rhythm. He sat white-fanged and long-furred by John Thornton's fire, but behind him were the shades of half-wolves and wild wolves. Each day the claims of mankind slipped further away. Deep in the forest, a call was sounding. Whenever Buck heard it, he felt driven to leave the fire and plunge into the forest. But his love for John Thornton always drew him back to the fire. When Thornton's partners, Hans and Pete, arrived on their raft, Buck refused to have anything to do with them. After learning that they were friends, he put up with them. But he never showed them any affection. By the time they reached Dawson, Hans and Pete understood Buck and his ways. For Thornton, however, Buck's love seemed to grow and grow. Thornton alone could put a pack on Buck's back. Nothing was too great for Buck to do if Thornton commanded it. One day, the men and the dogs were sitting in a tall cliff that dropped some 300 feet straight down. Thornton sat on the edge with Buck, and Buck at his side. On a whim, Thornton got the attention of Hans. Then he commanded, "Jump, Buck!" The next instant, he was wrestling Buck off the edge of the cliff. Hans and Pete dragged them back to safety. "It's eerie," Pete said. Thornton shook his head. "No, it's wonderful," he said. It sometimes makes me afraid." "I wouldn't want to be a man that bothers you when he's around," Pete added. Before the year is out, Pete's worries were realized. Black, Borton, a bad-tempered man, had been picking a fight with a newcomer in a bar. Thornton stepped between the men good-naturedly. Buck, as usual, was lying in the corner, watching his master. Without warning, Burton threw a fist straight for his shoulder. Thornton was sent spinning into the bar. Buck roared when he saw this and flew through the air at Burton's throat. The man threw out his arm, but was hurled back onto the floor. Buck let go of his arm and again went for his throat. This time, Buck caught it and tore it open. Quickly, the crowd drove Buck off. While the doctor checked the bleeding, Buck growled furiously. He was kept away by men with hostile clubs. A meeting was held on the spot. It was decided that Buck had a right to attack. From that day on, Buck's fame spread through every camp in Alaska. Later, in the fall, Buck saved Thornton's life in another way. 3 men were going down a bad stretch of rapids on 40 Mile Creek. Thornton was in a boat, guiding it with a pole. Hans and Pete moved along the bank, holding the boat with ropes tied to the trees. On the bank, Buck watched his master anxiously. At a particularly bad spot, Hans tried to slow the boat with a rope, but he jerked the rope too soon, and the boat flipped bottom up. Thornton was flown into the churning water. It swiftly carried him to the wildest part of the rapids. No swimmer could survive in that current. Buck instantly sprang into the rapids. In a mad swirl of water, he reached Thornton. When he felt Thornton grab his tail, Buck swam for the bank. Even with all his strength, Buck could only move very slowly toward shore. The man and the dog were moving downstream rapidly. They heard the water below roaring through jagged rocks that looked like the teeth of a huge comb. Thornton knew the shore was impossible to reach. He scratched across several rocks and struck the third violently. He let go of Buck, held fast to the slippery rock. "Go, Buck, go!" he shouted. Buck swam to shore, where Pete and Hans dragged him from the water. They knew that Thornton could not hold on to that rock for very long. They ran up the bank to a place that was far upstream from Thornton. They tied a rope carefully around Buck's neck and shoulders. Buck jumped into the stream and swam for Thornton. But the stream carried him faster than he expected. Buck passed helplessly out of Thornton's reach. Hans pulled Buck back through the water. When he reached Hans and Pete, Buck was half drowned. He staggered to his feet and then fell down. Thornton's voice could be heard faintly. Hearing it, Buck sprang to his feet and ran again to the water's edge. Again he struck out for Thornton. This time he did not make a mistake. Hans let the rope go, while Pete kept it from twisting. Thornton saw Buck coming. Buck struck him with the force of the current behind him. Thornton reached up and put both arms around Buck's shaggy neck. When Hans wrapped the rope around a tree, they were both pulled underwater, choking and smashing against the rocks. They veered towards shore. Thornton came to, face down on the bank. Buck's limp and seemingly lifeless body lay nearby. Slowly, Buck came round. Thornton, who was himself bruised and battered, felt Buck's body and found 3 broken ribs. "That settles it," he announced. "We camp right here." And camp they did until Buck's ribs healed. When man and dog were mended, the group was able to travel again. The Call of the Wild by Jack London, Chapter 8, For the Love of a Man. That winter, at Dawson, Buck performed another heroic deed. This one was perhaps not as dangerous, but it was one that made his fame grow even more. In a particularly happy deed for 3 men. It was a particularly happy deed for 3 men. Buck made it possible for them to make a trip to the east, where, so far, no gold miners had gone. It started with the El Dorado Saloon, where men bragged about their favorite dog. Buck, because of his fame, was being ridiculed. Thornton was driven to defend Buck's strength. One man said that his dog could pull a sleigh with 500 pounds on it. A second man claimed 600 pounds for his dog, and a third man 700. Pooh, John Thornton said. Buck can move 1,000 pounds. And walk off with it 100 yards, a man named Matherson demanded. He was the one who claimed 700 pounds for his dog. And walk off with it for 100 yards, Thornton said coolly. Well, Matherson said slowly, I've got $1,000 that says he can't. And there it is. As he spoke, he slammed a sack of gold dust bars on the bar. Nobody spoke. Thornton's bluff, if it was a bluff, had been called. He felt his blood rush to his face. His tongue had tricked him. He did not know whether or not Buck was able to move 1,000 pounds. 1/2 a ton? The eyes of a dozen men stared at him. What was more, he did not have $1,000. Neither did Hans or Pete. I've got a sled outside now, Matthewson went on. If it has 20 50-pound sacks of flour on it. Thornton did not answer. He did not know what to say. He glanced from face to face, looking for an answer. Jim O'Brien, an old friend, caught his eye. Seeing him, Thornton did what he would never have dreamed of doing. Can you lend me $1,000? He said softly. Sure, O'Brien answered. He thumped down a sack of gold dust. Though there's little chance I'm given that dog can do it. The men steamed out of the Eldorado to see the test. Several hundred men in furs and mittens crowded around the sled. Matthewson's sled was, with its 1,000 pounds, had been standing there for hours. In the 60 below zero cold, the runners had frozen fast to the snow. Even at 3-to-1 odds, not one man bet on Buck. Thornton had been rushed into the bet. Now, as he looked at the sled, the task seemed impossible. Matthewson was overjoyed. 3-to-1, he shouted. I'll bet you another 1,000, Thornton. What do you say? Thornton's fighting spirit was roused. He forgot how impossible the task looked. This was a battle, and he called Hans and Pete to his side. Together, the three men had only $200. Without stopping to think, they put it up against Matthewson's 600. Matthewson's team was unhitched, and Buck was put on the sled. He caught the excitement. He felt in some way that he had to do a great thing for Thornton. The men murmured as they watched this splendid animal. Buck was in perfect condition. He was about 150 pounds of grit, his coat shorn like silk. His mane bristled. Tight muscles rolled below his skin. After some of the men had felt these iron-like muscles, the odds dropped to 2-to-1. Gad, sir, stuttered one man. I give you $800 for him, just as he stands. Thornton shook his head and stepped to Buck's side. The crowd became quiet, except for the gamblers offering odds. Thornton took Buck's head in his hands and held it next to his. As you love me, Buck, as you love me, he whispered. Buck whined eagerly. The crowd watched this strange affair. Buck took Thornton's mittened hand softly in his mouth. Then he let it go. Thornton stepped back and said, Now, Buck! Buck swung to the right, taking up the slack in his harness. His 150 pounds stopped with a jerk. From under the sled, the runners rose, a crisp crackling sound. Ha! Thornton commanded. Buck plunged again, this time to the left. The cracking turned to snapping as the runners slipped several inches to the side. The sled was broken out. The men saw it and held their breath. Now, mush, Thornton yelled. Thornton's command cracked like a pistol shot. Buck threw himself forward. The harness tightened with a jerk. His muscles knotted under his fur. His head leaned forward While his feet crawled at the hard snow, the sled swayed and half started forward. One of his feet slipped, and the man groaned out loud. Then the sled lurched ahead. It moved in a rapid series of jerks. 1/2 inch, 1 inch, 2 inches. The jerk decreased until the sled moved steadily along. Men gasped, then began to breathe again. Thornton was running behind the sled. He encouraged Buck with his cheery words. A pile of firewood marked the end of 100 yards. A cheer grew into a roar as Buck passed the firewood. Every man, even Matthewson, let out a yell. Hats and mittens were flying in the air. Men were shaking hands all around in a babel of noise. Thornton fell on his knees beside Buck and held the dog's head against his own. "Gad, sir! Gad, sir!" spluttered a man who had offered $800 for Buck. "I'll give you 1,000 for him. Sir, 1,000. Sir, 1,200. Thornton rose to his feet. His eyes were wet. "Sir," he said, "you can go to hell." Buck took Thornton's hand in his teeth. Thornton shook him back and forth. The onlookers drew back. They knew not to intrude in such a moment.